So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the appendicular skeleton, and we're going to start with the pectoral girdle and the upper extremity or arm. So what I want to first do is just show you the bones that we're going to talk about. So the pelvic girdle is actually comprised of two bones, this really flat bone that we're seeing here, which is the scapula, and this long bone here that is the clavicle. And the scapula and the clavicle are responsible for connecting your arm to the axial skeleton that we did in the last lab. So as we move away from these two, then the large bone of the upper arm is this one, which is the humerus. The bone of our antebrachial region, or lower arm, has two bones. This bone with this large groove or notch in it is the ulna, and this bone with the really rounded head is the radius. Then as we move to the hand, we have a group of small bones that we refer to as carpals. And then we have 5 bones that form the palm of your hand, which we refer to as metacarpals. And then we have bones that form our fingers, 2 in our thumb and 3 in all of our other fingers, that we call phalangeal bones. And so that's an overview. So as you're beginning to study this, make sure that you can get all these bones out of the box so that you're ready to study the arm. So let's go over here to this one. So I just wanted to show you how they are organized. So the scapula sits on the posterior aspect of your ribs with its really flat plate sitting against the ribs. In this elevation we call a spine projecting backwards. Now if we rotate this around, we'll see that the role of the clavicle is actually to connect to the manubrium of the sternum and then to connect to the end of that spinous process that we call the acromion. And in anterior, we have another projection that we call the coracoid process. And then laterally, we have a really flat surface that we call the glenoid fossa, in which the head of the humerus is going to set. So now that we have our orientation on how this sets, we can actually look at some component parts, and we can see how quickly we can tell whether this is a left or right scapula. So this is a posterior view of the scapula with the spinous process on it. Here's the anterior view of the scapula, so you can see how it sits against the ribs on this anterior view. And then if you look at the lateral view of the scapula, then you can see the coracoid process, the glenoid fossa, and the acromion process. And they create a socket in which the head of the humerus is going to sit. So when we look at the scapula, remember that the edge of a bone is called a border. So because the scapula is really flat, we have 3 primary borders, this border, and this border above. So the borders are given names that that give you a reference to location. So this points toward your vertebral column on your posterior surface, so it's the vertebral border. This would be found and palpated in your armpit, and so this is the axillary border. So this would be sitting on the top of the bone, so this is the superior border. Now, when a bone changes an angle, when a bone changes direction, we call it an angle. So the scapula also has 2 prominent angles. So the very elongated angle that points inferior in anatomical position is the inferior border. And this less long angle that is on the superior portion of the bone is called the superior border. So in anatomical position, this bone would set like this, being inferior and superior. This would be the posterior surface. So when you would organize this as it would set in me, then it would set like this. So we know this would be a right scapula. because of that. So a couple of other things that you'll need to know on the scapula is we have depressed areas. So on the anterior aspect of the scapula, the depressed area is called the subscapular fossa. If we turn it over and look at the posterior view of the scapula, then what's below or inferior to the spinous process is the infraspinous fossa. And then what we would see, this depression above the spinous process, is the supraspinous fossa. And those are going to be places where muscles are going to attach as we go into the third unit on muscles. So this is the spinous process of the scapula. As it comes forward, it flattens out. So this flattened portion is the acromion of the scapula. When you look at the edge of the acromion, you'll see that you have a very flat, smooth surface. And this is where the clavicle articulates with the acromion process of the clavicle. And then again, as we look from this angle, we have this projection, which is the coracoid process. And just as a reference, cora is the genus of a raven, and early anatomists thought this looked like a raven's bill, hence the name coracoid process. And then the glenoid fossa, which is a depression. So the bone that interacts with this is this bone, which is a clavicle. So when you look at a clavicle, the clavicle has a real flattened portion on one end, and on the other end, a more triangular portion. So the thing to remember is the flattened portion of the clavicle is what articulates with the flattened portion of the scapula. So this is called the acromial extremity of the clavicle. And then this end articulates with the sternum, so this is called the sternal extremity of the clavicle. Now, left and right on the clavicle is easy if you understand one particular process. So toward the acromial end of the clavicle, there is an elevation which is called the conoid tubercle. So conoid is a reference to cone-shaped. So this elevation here, the conoid tubercle, in anatomical position is posterior and inferior. So if I were holding this clavicle like this, it's on the top, so that would be wrong. If I rotate the clavicle like this, it's on the anterior view, so that would be wrong. So in anatomical position, this clavicle would sit like this, where this is on the posterior and pointing inferior. So these two bones would match. This is a right clavicle that would articulate with the right scapula that we looked at. So moving down on our bones that make up our upper extremity, then the large bone that's in the brachium of the arm is the humerus. And when you look at the humerus is a bone that's got a head. So this really rounded surface is a head that creates an articular surface that has three axial planes on which it can move. Now, remember in bones, if we have a head, we have a neck. And so the humerus is a bone that actually has two necks. So we find the head, there's this little groove that's associated with the head as we go around it here. That's the anatomical neck. But this narrowing at the top of the shaft is the surgical neck, and that comes from total shoulder replacement surgery where they would cut the bone off here. Now, what we'll see on bones is some projected areas that really function to allow muscle attachment for them. So when you look at them, then what we have is we have this very large projection here, and we have a smaller projection here, and we have this little groove between them. So the larger projection is called the greater tubercle. This smaller projection is called the lesser tubercle. And then this groove between them is the intertubercular groove, or sulcus. And some people refer to it as the bicipital sulcus because one of the biceps tendons passes through here. So in anatomical position, the greater tubercle is lateral, the lesser tubercle is anterior, and the bicipital groove or intertubercular sulcus is anterior. Now, as we move down the shaft of the humerus, then laterally we have an enlargement on the shaft of the humerus we see here, which is where the deltoid muscle attaches. And so this is referred to as the deltoid tuberosity. Now, as we move downward, the next structures you need to know are going to be in the distal end of the humerus and the part that actually helps create your elbow. So when we look at long bones that create joints for movement, real rounded surfaces are called condyles. So these two are condyles. And then roughened areas above them are referred to as epicondyles. And epicondyles are places for muscle attachment, ligament attachment to maintain the joint. So in anatomical position, this would be my lateral condyle. This would be my medial condyle. So this becomes the medial epicondyle, and this becomes the lateral epicondyle. And then if you feel the inside or medial aspect of your elbow, you'll feel a really bony prominence there that you can palpate through your skin real easily, and that's this medial epicondyle. The lateral epicondyle is a little harder to palpate. Now, anatomically, even though these are condyles, lateral and medial condyles, they actually have specific names on the humerus. So the medial condyle, this surface, is called the trochlea, and then the lateral condyle, this surface, is called the capitulum. And then what we're going to see as we construct the bones and put them together to form an arm is that the ulna articulates with the trochlea, and the radius articulates with the capitulum, so that our two middle bones, our two lower bones of the antebrachium, actually attach to these two surfaces. Now, the other thing is we have a depression on the anterior surface of the humerus here, and we have a depression on the posterior surface of the humerus. And this dorsal or posterior surface is really, really deep, and so it's called the olecranon fossa. And if we come over to the anterior surface again, then the depression we see here is the coronoid fossa. And what we're going to see is there's bony projections on the trochlea that's going to fit into this. There are bony projections as part of the trochlea that are trochlear notch on the ulna that fit into this and this. So let's move to the ulna next, and we'll see that one of the characteristics of the ulna is this big notch, which is called the trochlear notch. And then if we put these bones together, then these bones would fit just like this. And so you can see that that smooth surface creates an articular point to it.